Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on attack and defense. Here is our first example. We can see that black has a tremendous material advantage having an extra rook. The only thing that goes for white is that black is missing a pawn near his king on h7 or from the h file, and that gives white some little hope. Well, there are two lessons to be learned from this lesson. That it doesn't matter how big of a material advantage you may have, you always need to be cautious for your opponent's counterplay and attack, especially if that attack targets your king. So we're going to see different scenarios how this position can play out and the dangers that black may face and the traps that black needs to avoid in order to maintain their advantage and eventually win the game. The only move here that gives hope for white is to create a cooperation between the white queen and bishop. The order to accomplish that is to move the bishop to b1. As you can see now, there is a battery between the white bishop and queen aiming all the way towards the h7 square to the black king. What happened now is white is threatening to checkmate the black king with moving the queen to h7. So the big question is, from black's perspective, what should black do? How should black defend? In this position, there are three methods that black can experiment with. One is to move the rook from f8 and create an escape square for a black king to move out of the check. Another one is to try to directly protect the h7 square. I suggest you try to pause the video for a moment and try to figure out what that move would be that would protect the h7 square. What that means is that if the white queen moves there after black's move, the black piece will be able to capture the white queen, and therefore the queen h7 move would lose effect. And lastly, the third method is to try to put one of the black pieces in between the white queen and the h7 square on that same diagonal. So let's go over the different options one by one. One option is to block the diagonal by moving the f-pawn to f5. Now obviously black stopped that move. It's impossible to jump over the pawn and move the queen there. However, this in fact would be a serious mistake, giving white the opportunity to save the game. The way white can save the game here is all of a sudden move the bishop back where it came from to a2 and say check. Now, if black blocks the check with the bishop on d5, the white bishop or queen could simply capture that and then capture the rook in the corner on a8. If black blocks the check with the rook, obviously that does not look very good, because the white bishop could capture the rook, although that's not even the best move, because after bishop takes rook and king takes back, black now still has an extra bishop. And white, even though seemingly can give a fork right now and win the black bishop on b7, in reality, black will be able to save himself. For example, after queen b3, which is a check, and at the same time attacking the bishop on b7, black can block that check with the queen or even with the bishop and save the bishop. Also, if white would give the check from d7, again attacking the black king and the bishop, black has a saving move, and that is not by moving the king, but again blocking the check with the queen and protecting the bishop at the same time. Nevertheless, in the starting position after bishop b1, f5 is a mistake, and after bishop a2, rook f7 is a further mistake because it allows white to immediately use the pin by moving the queen to d7. The black rook is pinned, therefore it cannot capture the white queen. At the same time, white now is targeting the rook on f7 not only with the queen but also with the bishop. So therefore, white now is threatening to capture that rook for free. And after black would protect the rook, white would have the time to first capture the bishop on b7, still and again using the pin, and only on the following move capture the rook with the bishop. At the end of that day, when the white bishop captures the rook and the black rook from f8 captures back, white will end up being a pawn. Let's go back again and check it out. Bishop b1, f5 we said was an error, but the big question is, how does white indeed save the game if after this bishop check on a2, the black king moves out to the h file and doesn't voluntarily give up his rook? Obviously, I'm not talking about moving the king to the corner, which would allow white in fact even win the game by moving the queen to h3. Right? You definitely do not want to allow that if you're playing with the black pieces here. So the real question is, what happens if that king moves out to h7? Now black still has his extra rook, and seemingly white's attack doesn't go anywhere. But reality is that white can now constantly keep checking the black king and achieve a draw by repetition of moves by perpetual checks. And that first check would come from h3. Now the black king has only one and only choice, moving to g6. And then queen g3. If the king moves back to the h file, so would the white queen move back to the h file as well. And if the king goes the other way towards f6, then the queen check comes from h4. Now the black king can only go either to e5 or back to g6. After either of them, white would respond with the queen going back to g3, and black even needs to be careful not to go too far out to the wild, so to say, before the white rook will also participate in the attack and the black king can get checkmated very easily in the middle of the board. So black, better off, settles for a draw while he can and keep repeating moves, moving back and forth, and the game would end in a draw. Don't forget, even when you're ahead material, but you're in danger of getting checkmated, you're better off settle in a draw and repeat moves rather than even lose the game. Okay, let's go all the way back. Now we know that after bishop b1, white pushing the f7 pawn up to f5 would be a mistake because it would open the a2 g8 diagonal and white would have sufficient counterplay to save the game and draw. Let's talk a moment about the option of moving the rook out of the king's way and clearing the f8 square for the king's escape. At the same time, the black rook right now is attacking the white queen also. Here again, white would get very good counterplay after playing queen h7 check, chasing the king to f8, and now white could get some counterplay by playing queen h8 check and capturing an additional pawn on g7. There is no need for black to give this much counterplay for white. Also, an interesting idea white may have in this position to play rook e1, and this move would cut away the further escape of the black king, and in fact threaten with checkmate with the queen h8 move in one move. It's true, black can still escape here, but as I said, it would give unnecessary chances for white. Black's best move at this stage would be to play f6, and then white could try to stop the black king's escape by playing bishop a2, taking away or taking control of the f7 square. Again, renewing the threat with the queen, in fact, not only on h8, but also on g8. And right now, black has an only move that maintains the advantage, and that is to move the rook to d5. And then after bishop takes rook and bishop takes bishop, black still maintains some advantage. But let's see, why would it be so bad to instead block with the bishop, still stop the checkmate threat, but not give up an exchange? The problem now is that again, white can save the game with perpetual checks. The queen can move to h8, and after king f7, the queen just keeps checking and checking. And if now the king doesn't want to repeat moving to f8, but moves to g8, that would allow for white a very nice and effective combination, namely moving the rook to e8, sacrificing the rook, and deflecting a piece, removing the guard, the rook, from d8, and then capture the bishop with a check on d5. Now black has to be very careful. If the king would move out of the check, white would checkmate right away. Therefore, in this position, black is forced to give up the queen for the bishop, and now white has balanced the material, having a queen and pawn for 2 rooks. Again, let's go back to our starting position and examine what may be the best options here for black. Well, black has 2 reasonably good, about equally good options. One is to simply block the threat with the g-pawn. The reason why this is so much better than pushing the f-pawn up by 2 squares, the variation that we started with, because now black weakens the dark squares and not the light squares where his king is. And more importantly, it's in the opposite colors of the squares that the white bishop is running on. So in a situation when your opponent only has a light squared bishop like here, you rather create a weakness in front of your king along the dark squares, so your opponent has less opportunities to attack that. Like in this case, only the white queen could potentially attack those dark squares on the king side. Without an aid, without the bishop or another piece, it doesn't mean too much. As we saw, on the other hand, if black would move up the f-pawn, weakening the light squares, where the white bishop could bother the black king, it wouldn't work so well. And lastly, the other good option that black has after bishop b1 is to play queen h5. I would rate queen h5 or g6 pretty much equally good, maintaining black's clear advantage, and the win shouldn't be too far away. Let's move on to another example where again black has tremendous material advantage. Here we go. In this position, black has not only an extra rook, but also an extra knight and an extra pawn. That's a tremendous material advantage, 9 points, which in all reality equals to a queen. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter how good your position is or how much advantage you think you have, you still have to be cautious and not to fall in your opponent's traps. In this position, white can create an attack that black needs to defend against accurately. By moving the queen to h4, white right now immediately threatens to checkmate by moving the queen to h7. It's one of those typical examples when if you see a check, it doesn't mean it's a good move. It looks like a natural move to move the queen to c1, and if white would choose to move out of the check, it would not be a mistake because black would continue the same defensive way, the one they should. However, this check would at the same time also allow white to improve his position greatly by blocking the check with the rook. What would happen right now is that while white is still maintaining the threat to checkmate on h7 with the queen, at the same time white is also attacking the black queen. What that means is that if black simply moves his queen out of the danger, the checkmate would arrive. So the best thing black can do at this stage is to give up his queen for a white rook. And that would obviously give back a good chunk of black's material advantage. So let's go back to the starting position and look at the position again after queen h4. What should black do? By the way, another thing to notice is that in addition to the checkmate threat, white also attacked the black rook on e7. Of course, black needs to attend the primary threat, the checkmate threat, and he has actually a good move. Hopefully you can figure out what that good move is. Before we follow up on what the good move is, let me just mention that moving your rook away from f8 to e8 would be losing, even though it protects the rook, and also clears an escape square for the black king on f8. It would still allow checkmate, but not in one, but in two moves. After king f8, queen h8 would be ending the game. Again, after queen h4, the only correct move is moving knight to f6. This move simply guards the h7 square and keeps black safe. Of course, the game is not quite over. Black still needs to make a couple of accurate moves to guarantee the win. White can still play here rook to h3. Now, the white queen threatens to checkmate on h8, not on h7. What should black do? How can black guard that square? Well, black cannot guard the h8 square. However, black can force the exchange of the queens, or even better, counterattack against the white king to guarantee the win. The way to accomplish that is to now give the check on c1 when the white rook already cannot block it, like in the previous variation. And after king f2 or king h2, either one, black can already force the exchange of the queens, which will be the end of white's attack at the same time, and simply transpose to an easily winning endgame. In this particular case, black can do even better and play knight g4 check. The white king has only one move out, and then checkmate on the following move with queen takes pawn. A very instructive example. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, it is white's turn. Just like in our previous two positions, black has an impressive material advantage, being up 9 points. That's a tremendous material advantage. But again, it's a good example how you should not underestimate your opponent's attack, and always look out not only for your own good moves, but of your opponent's at the same time. Only by always assuming and expecting your opponent's best move, you can make your objectively best moves. If in this position, white would start the attack by moving the knight to g5, threatening with queen takes pawn on h7 checkmate, black could defend very simply by playing f6 and opening the queen's power towards the h7 pawn and be just fine and win easily with a tremendous material advantage that black already has accumulated. A bit more challenging is how to respond if white first pushes his pawn to f6. We discussed in some of the previous lessons how powerful a pawn on f6 and a queen on h6 can be against a kingside castling position of the black king. Right now, black has two good moves that would save the game and maintain black's advantage. They pretty much lead to similar situations, and it would be only an order of moves that would be transposed. Let's look at rook g8, which is the most natural move. The other option would be to do the check first on d1. Now, of course, the critical move is, what if the white knight moves to g5 to support the white queen in trying to checkmate by capturing the pawn on h7? Now, this is a tricky moment. Black has serious threats that he cannot deal with directly, so he needs to look for an indirect way to defend against this checkmate. That could be by removing one of white's attacking pieces. Black can start by either giving a check on d1 or on d4. However, only one of them does the job. Giving the check on d1, which looks very natural, is indeed a real big mistake. Now, the white king would go to h2, and then the move that at first seemed to save the game, that would trade queens, would allow the trade and then white to checkmate the black king. So that certainly does not seem like working. How about if the black queen moves back to d6? Well, then the white king would move to the corner, and the best black could do is keep repeating moves between d1 and d6. And that would end the game in a draw. So let's see what is the correct way to play. f6, rook g8, defending the g7 square, knight g5, and the correct route is to play queen d4 check. Now, after king h2, a second check on e5, and then we have to do what we have to do. We want to make sure we don't get checkmated. We do not want to repeat moves. We're trying to win the game, and we better take the knight. Sometimes we have to do what looks painful, give up a queen for a knight. However, black is still ahead, having 2 rooks and 2 pawns against the queen. 2 rooks equal 10 plus 2, that's 12, so black is still in considerable material advantage. And more importantly, black has a very dangerous passed pawn that immediately can be pushed, and white indeed needs to hurry up to make sure that pawn doesn't become a queen right away. And white can only stop it becoming a queen temporarily, because now the black rook comes to the b file, followed by coming to b1, chasing the white queen out of there, and then the pawn promotes and black wins easily. Let's go back to the beginning, and just for another moment, let's see what the other option was. After f6, the other option that worked was to give the check on d1 at first. Now the difference is that the white king goes to h2, then black would not play rook g8, because then after knight g5 we reach the same scenario as we saw earlier, but can play queen d6 check, followed up by simply capturing the pawn on f6 and solving the checkmate threat that way, and after knight g5 just move the queen to g7 and black is safe and sound. On the other hand, if after f6, queen d1, king goes to f2, then black indeed needs to play rook g8, and after knight g5, black can play in a similar fashion as we saw in the main line, check, and then give up the queen for the knight and count on the a-pawn becoming a queen. A very instructive example. Well, that's all for this lesson. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess advice. So long.